So I hope you're all okay with being recorded. Don't say anything that can be held against you in a court of law. Okay. So the shiur this evening is, I think, dealing with a really fascinating question. I'm going to share my screen with you here. This week's Parshat Ray, has a lot in it. There's a lot of different mitzvot, and it deals mainly with the centrality of the Mishkan or the Beit HaMikdash, Yerushalayim. I thought to do some exploration maybe of the fact that Yerushalayim is not actually mentioned. It just says, I will, go to that place that I will show you, that I will choose, but nowhere in the Torah does it actually say Yerushalayim. I thought to maybe do that, but I said we'll do something different. And the truth is, everything is related to that question of the Mishkan, the Beit HaMikdash, the holy place, the sacrifices. But in the middle of Parshat Ray, this is not the only place where this happens. It also happens in quite significant detail in Shmini. It goes through, again, kosher and non-kosher animals. And the question is, is there something unwholesome? Is there something unhealthy about those animals? So there's a list. I should have brought them here. Let's see if we can find, well, that's the easiest way to do it. Anyway, well, you have a sense. We know what the animals are. We know what the unkosher animals are. What do you think? I'll just throw it open before we kind of jump into it. Do you have any thought over whether the animals mentioned in the Torah are specifically unhealthy? Don't read the Moreh Nevuchim just yet. I'm going to stop sharing the more.
Well, there is that thing about pigs and trichinosis.
Okay, yeah, true. That's just pigs.
But we don't know everything about the history of that time, and it may have been the case that some of those animals conveyed disease, but we don't really know that.
Well, so but in your statement, there's kind of an assumption that it's something to do with a certain kind of health awareness, right? That we don't necessarily know about, but it's still nonetheless. Yeah, maybe. Okay.
Maybe. It's not central to what being kosher is all about.
Okay, good. So we'll talk about this a little bit more. Any other thoughts? Anybody have any thoughts as to whether or not, are non-kosher food unhealthy? Is it less healthy than kosher food? What do you think?
Depends how much of it you eat.
Yes, and if you can eat the wrong things as kosher food, just as much.
Right.
Just as unhealthy.
And we'll have to hold that thought because we'll get back to that in a little bit. Anybody else? No? Okay.
Tell me about it. I'm pigging out here in isolation.
I think we all are. We all are. So the first place that we're going to look is in the Moreh Nevuchim of the Rambam. So Maimonides, the great Rishon, the great sage, he brought forth a lot of his philosophical ideas in his book called the Moreh Nevuchim and the Guide to the Perplexed. And the Rambam here takes a position that is consistent with a position that he takes on other areas of law, which kind of, if we step back, is a bigger question here. Because one of the questions that we're also facing is, are there rational reasons, human practical reasons behind the mitzvot or not? When we talk about the ta'amei ha-mitzvot, when there's a particular mitzvah, can we, with our human minds, understand why that particular mitzvah exists or not, or what's the purpose of it? The Rambam is very clear that we do try. Okay, there are what are called chukim. There are laws that seemingly don't have a rational reason behind them, but the Rambam still tries to find them. The Rambam still he believes that there is a rational reason behind the mitzvot. And so that shines through regarding this particular question. So in the Moreh Nevuchim, he says the following thing. I maintain that the food which is forbidden by the law is unwholesome. There is nothing among forbidden kinds of foods whose injurious character is doubted except pork and fat. But also in these cases, the doubt is not justified, right? So like nobody doubt, all other non-kosher foods, everyone recognizes are unhealthy, and it's just pork and fat that, or when we talk about fats, we're talking about the specific fats of what's called the chalev, the parts, the unwanted parts of an animal, even a kosher animal, or specifically a kosher animal, like a cow, has many parts of the cow that we're not allowed to eat as Jews, called the chalev, the fats. And so even those things, even some people doubt that, oh no, the fats are kosher, not kosher, the fats are healthier, the pork is healthy, but it says, even in these cases, the doubt is not justified. For, and he doesn't mention trichinosis, but he says, for pork contains more moisture than necessary for human food and too much of superfluous matter. The principal reason why the law forbids swine's flesh is to be found in circumstances that its habits and its food are very dirty and loathsome. It has already been pointed out how emphatically the law enjoins the removal of the sight of loathsome objects, even in the field and in the camp. How much more objectionable is a sight in town. But if it were allowed to eat swine's flesh, the streets and houses would be more dirty than any cesspool, as may be seen at present in the country of the Franks. A saying of our sages declare, the mouth of the swine is as dirty as dung itself. Okay, so the Rambam seems to be very clear there. He says the reason why these animals, and I should have brought the whole list of all the different animals that, you know, the bunny and the cow and all those sorts of, not the cow, the camel, right? All these sorts of animals. There's something unhealthy. There is something unwholesome. There is something about them that itself makes it unhealthy. And the pig stands at the height of it, even if, you know, like it could, you know, like be kept in clean, you know, a clean cage, unless there's something unhealthy about this animal. And the Rambam is very, very clear about that. He then says, well, what is it that makes kosher foods kosher, right? What is it that makes kosher foods kosher? So he says the following thing. The characteristics given in the law of the permitted animals, vis-a-vis chewing the cud and dividing hoofs for cattle and fins and scales for fish, are in themselves neither the cause of the permission when they are present, nor of the prohibition when they are absent, but merely signs by which the recommended species of animals can be discerned from that which are forbidden. What's the Rambam saying there? Can anyone pick up what the Rambam is saying there?
Well, he's giving a conceptual basis for kashrut by allowing us to decide, well, there's a group of animals which are kosher, and some of them may not be named, but if we discovered, as people have done, another animal that's got cloven hoofs and chews the cud, then that's going to be kosher.
Right.
So he's expanding the range of possible foods which are kosher on the basis of an abstract definition.
But he's doing more than that.
Oh, yeah.
Because he's saying something about they're not, they themselves aren't the cause of the permission. So
Right.
It's not that they have these characteristics. Those characteristics are just a sign.
Yeah.
Right.
But what about, I don't get this, when they are absent?
Meaning, let's say a fish does not have fins or scales.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
If they're absent, it's not kosher, but the absence of those fins or scales is not the cause of why it's not kosher. Now it is, obviously, if they're absent fins and scales, but he's saying there's something underneath that, meaning though that fish is unhealthy, it's not good for you. How can you identify what is not good for you? The fins and scales, or the lack of fins or scales. but it's not the lack of fins or scales that makes it not good for you. Right? You hear that?
Yeah.
Yep.
Just want to make that point clear from the Rambam, right? He's saying the signs of kashrut are not that the thing that makes the food kosher. I mean, it's the sign. It's the sign, but it's not the reason.
Okay. If I were an expert geneticist and I could grow a shark that had fins and scales, that wouldn't make the shark kosher.
Okay, that's an interesting point, right? Like that hypothetical situation wasn't available in the past. Right. I mean, it depends on what it would look like. Seemingly not, because those fins and scales are what allow, or the lack of fins and scales are what allows us to identify the kosher species. If there was a non-kosher species, seemingly then we're able to manipulate it so it had those signs of kashrut, it wouldn't make it kosher, seemingly. That's what I would assume.
Yeah.
But with that being said, okay, we spent a long time on the Rambam. The Rambam is very clear, right? So if we were to say, does the Rambam believe that that non-kosher animals are unhealthy? What would we say?
Yes.
A resounding yes, 100%. There's no question. Okay, we've got the Rambam there. The Ramban, Nachmanides, who very often butts heads with the Rambam, he agrees, and he takes a different approach, which you might have heard as well, a very famous approach. So here he's talking, this is from Parshat Shmini, but why are there certain animals, certain birds that are forbidden? So he says the following thing. He says, the reason for certain birds being forbidden as food is on account of their cruel nature. It is also possible that the reason for certain animals being forbidden is similar, since no animal that chews the cud and has a parted hoof is a beast of prey, while the rest all devour others. There has also been found a difference in nature between animals fit for food and those which are unfit, as the sages have mentioned, namely that all milks of animals fit for food curdle, whereas all milks of those unfit for food do not coagulate and cannot ever be made into cheese. Thus, they are physically different. It is possible to say on the basis of this difference in their natures that those animals unfit for food harm human beings who eat them. So the Ramban
I thought you could make camel cheese.
It's possible. I don't know. The Ramban seems to say that you can't.
Yeah.
This was a I mean, you definitely can't make pig cheese, right? I know that's discussed in the Gemara. Camel cheese, I don't know. I'm sure we could Google it, right? I'm sure there's somebody who makes some sort of.
We're not planning to rush out and buy some.
Well, theoretic, right? You're in the world of theoretical thoughts, right? I'm sure somebody Google it. Can you make camel cheese? Okay. You'll get back to me in a moment when somebody has the information. But the Ramban. So first, let's just note the Ramban's initial statement, which is, why are certain birds prohibited? Because they are birds of prey, right? And we as Jews, calm and docile, and peaceful people, we don't want to, what is this idea? You are what you eat, right? In essence. So we don't want to eat foods that are, sorry?
Hami was saying that he checked it. It is possible to...
Camel's milk is very low in fat, but you can coagulate it apparently and make camel's cheese.
Okay, interesting. There you go.
The other thing I'd like to comment on is, why are birds of prey called cruel? They're just being natural.
Yeah, that is a good point. I think
it's very anthropomorphic. I mean, we believe it's wrong to kill fellow human beings. We're not objecting to killing animals for our own sake, as long as we do it the right way. But it's just an analogy. I mean, we think killing fellow human beings is an evil thing to do.
Yeah.
And you see birds killing birds, that's seen as sort of something unpleasant. But of course.
Yeah, it's seen as a lower, even though yes, it is just their nature, it's how they eat, and it is what it is. But it's seen as kind of a lower level than an animal like a cow that just eats grass.
There's actually no defining characteristic of birds. I mean, the Torah just lists a few examples of birds with Hebrew names for them, and we don't even know exactly what species they are. But there's no particular characteristic that says this kind of bird is kosher and this kind of bird is not.
Yeah, that's a good point. Except for, right, and so then the Ramban says, oh, it must be that some of those birds are birds of prey, but that's not necessarily true of all of them. If people are more interested in this particular topic, Rabbi Natan Slifkin has written some incredible books on animals in halacha and in the Torah. Natan Slifkin, Slifkin. He paid a personal price for the things that he wrote. He has very much disagreed with kind of more traditional approaches to interpretations of science and kind of more zoological elements. His books are fascinating. He's a zoologist, and he kind of anyway, really, really interesting stuff. So if anybody's interested in this particular topic, sorry, by Natan Slifkin, you can follow all his books were put into cherem. He was excommunicated as a result of his writings, and you know that he's good, right? You know you want to read his stuff. So the Ramban says, once again, if we look at the Rambam, just because there's a lot to cover this evening, if you look at the Rambam says it's definitely unhealthy for you. The Ramban says it's unethical, right? That there's something wrong with birds of prey. We don't want to internalize that, but also there's something unhealthy about the food itself. We can call into question, actually maybe in certain circumstances you can make camel cheese, but that doesn't necessarily reject the Ramban altogether. But clearly, if we look at the Rambam and the Ramban, they both agree that there is something unhealthy about non-kosher food. Okay, any questions or comments before we continue? I can only see some of you, so I've got Sandra, how you going? Sandy, how you doing? All good? Okay. Debbie, all well? And Judith and Tracy, it's good to see all of you. everyone's probably cooking for Shabbos as we're doing this. Just don't make camel cheese, okay? So the Rambam and the Ramban, my wife is not happy with my jokes. The Rambam, they're a lot nicer.
We enjoy it.
They all laughed. So.
Yeah, we like it.
But she has to be with me all day. So the Rambam and the Ramban, very clear. But what are some of the issues? Can we think of some issues with that approach? What do you think? What are some of the ways that we can kind of reject the opinion of the...
Well, one might think maybe he's just trying to be persuasive to the people and using arguments that ordinary human beings who are not so scholarly as he is, don't eat this, it's bad for you. In other words, whether or not it's good for you or bad for you, that might work as an argument that's more convincing than saying, well, you shouldn't eat this because that's what was said on Mount Sinai.
Well, that's to try to say that it's a more convinced, but it's a more, it might be more convincing. Well, what's still the problem with it, though? Well, because exactly, Jaime just looked up. He saw that camel milk can be turned into cheese, meaning we could find that actually there are some foods that are like some non-kosher foods that are really, really healthy.
Well, I suppose, what is the evidence that they're actually bad for you?
Right. Where's the evidence?
And one could say, you hinted at this before, if the argument that you shouldn't eat pig meat because they're filthy and disgusting animals and their mouths are like dung heaps and so on, then the counter argument to that would be, well, let us set up a farm where the pigs are kept in absolutely clean conditions and don't have any access to bad food. They're only fed stuff that's good for the pigs and they're completely clean. They still wouldn't be kosher.
Yeah.
So the argument,
exactly.
the argument would be negated by that sort of counter evidence.
Right, totally. And like I said, let's say we were to find that pigs specifically have something that human beings really need, or squid, right? Squid is like, and Jews didn't have access to squid, and now squid is like the healthiest thing, and everyone's going crazy for squid, right? Then what does that do? So when it becomes on rational grounds, then there's a problem, because then with the rational mind, we can kind of convince ourselves of anything. So the Abarbanel, the 15th century commentator, takes this approach. He attacks the Rambam and the Ramban. He says the following thing here. If you look in the second paragraph, God forbid that I should believe such a thing, meaning that the reason why we don't eat particular foods is because of a medical purpose, a health reason. If that were the case, then the Torah of the Lord would be no more than an insignificant and overly concise medical treatise. This is not the way of the Torah of the Lord or of its profound objectives. Besides, we see with our own eyes, we see how the nations that consume the flesh of the pig, detestable things, the mouse, as well as other impure birds, land animals, and fish, are all alive and well, strong and not feeble, and not at all feeble or frail. All of this is a clear indication that the divine Torah did not come to heal the body or to promote physical health, but rather to foster the health of the soul and to heal its afflictions. Therefore, the Torah forbade these foods because they have a deleterious effect on the pure and intelligent soul, breeding insensitivity in the human soul and corrupting its desires. This causes the formation of an evil nature that breeds a spirit of Tumah and banishes the spirit of Tahara and holiness, concerning which David implored, "Do not take your spirit of holiness from me."
I'd sort of like to see some evidence about that too.
Well, why do you say that?
Well, where's the evidence that these foods have a deleterious effect on our pure soul?
Well, I mean, that's a good question on this whole idea. But I guess you'd say, if the Torah is a book of spirituality and the wisdom of God, then there must be some, if it's not a purely physical reason, it must be some sort of spiritual reason, some sort of spiritual, it has some spiritual impact that is not, and you're a great scientist, right? You're asking from the science approach, right? Show me the proof. Where is the study? Give me some sort of a scientific method to figure out how this works. And it doesn't exactly work like that, right? Sorry? Say it again.
It's not likely to be subjectable to scientific proof, because we're not dealing with science really. I mean,
Correct.
religion and faith is a different area. It can be influenced by scientific findings, but it's not the same thing, and it shouldn't look for scientific evidence for dealing with something which is not open to scientific investigation.
Right, exactly. Now, again, that doesn't mean that necessarily, I think for a lot of rational thinking people, like, well, I don't see that happening, and how does that work? So, but just because we don't see it working doesn't mean it's not what's happening, right? I remember once I had a teacher who was not in very good shape, and he was saying how, like, he could eat anything and not feel it. Like, he could eat, like, sugar, like crazy amounts of sugar, and like it wouldn't affect him. And and I was saying, if I have a certain amounts of sugar, I'll just crash immediately afterwards. And so, like, it was almost kind of counter intuitive. Here's this guy who's not in very good shape, and he eats anything. It doesn't seem to impact his day, right? But it's kind of like, since he's with time becomes so insensitive to those things. He just kind of, you know, but there might be some sort of something going on. There definitely is something going on underneath that he's not necessarily aware of, and his body's actually being harmed greatly from it. And so kind of, on a spiritual sense, just because we don't know what impact it's having on our spiritual awareness doesn't necessarily mean anything. We just might not be sensitive to that awareness, right?
We can be sensitive to something else which is observable, and that's the fact that 3,000 years later, we are still a Jewish people that are together and think of ourselves as a Jewish people. And it's things like Kashrut and Shabbat observance that have certainly contributed to making that so.
Okay, so
that's not
Paul,
science.
Nice.
Yeah.
Paul's raised a very interesting point that we will see communicated later on as well, of maybe there is some other purpose as well to kashrut, which has allowed this very conversation that you and I are having to exist. Without it, maybe it wouldn't have existed. Who knows? I mean, that's a big statement. But the idea is that we have stayed together because of kosher laws, okay? And other things. There's no question. And other things, but kashrut has played an impact on that. Any questions, comments before we continue? What do you think? Let's look a little. I'm trying to think about the correct order to read these things in. Paul just mentioned the possibility that it's this idea of certain laws to keep the Jewish people together. There might be other practical laws behind, or practical reasons for the mitzvah of kashrut. So it's not necessary to say that kosher foods are any healthier than non-kosher foods. You see that. The Barbanel says that's not the case. But it does teach us something else. The Sefer Akedat Yitzchak says the following thing. It was not that their consumption was detrimental to the soul of man, but rather that abstention from them was conducive to self-control and discipline in life. The Akedat Yitzchak picks up on Helen's point of the critique of the Barbanel, like, wait a second, the Barbanel that we just learned a moment ago says the reason why we don't want to eat certain foods is that they're bad for our soul. How do we know? Who's to say? Okay, the Torah says so, but is that the reason why? We don't know. But maybe the Akedat Yitzchak says a different thing. He says that we abstain from certain foods because it teaches us self-control and discipline. Self-control is the distinctive feature marking man as superior to animals. By not being allowed to eat just anything that comes to his mouth or that he fancies, he will be disciplined, I should say, from his childhood, to exercise the same self-control that he is called upon to display in the dietary field and other fields, in accordance with the thought expressed at the end of the daily Shema, in the paragraph concerning the wearing of tzitzit. That you should not go astray after your own heart and after your own eyes. So what does the Akedat Yitzchak say? What is the purpose of kashrut? Or a purpose, a byproduct? Is this learning this self-control, acquiring the ability to not eat whatever comes your way. And this is deeply ingrained within the soul, or within the mind, the psyche of one who keeps kosher. Now, are there any issues that we might find with that?
I just wanted to make a comment.
Sure.
I just wish all chocolate was not kosher.
Oh, sorry.
I just wish all chocolate was not kosher.
Well, here's the thing, Elizabeth, right? And the point that you just made is actually a great segue into this next point, because what is a critique that we could add to this, which is often leveled at religious Jews, right? Our religious Jews aren't necessarily like today aren't really looked at as the healthiest of human beings, unfortunately, right? And it may be that in more ancient times, even when we say ancient, even 200, 300 years ago, before the Industrial Revolution, it may be that Jews, needed, by not being able to eat whatever they, desired. Thank you, Ori. Right? They could, that was healthier, right? They couldn't just grab that and grab that. There's certain foods they could eat. They weren't accessible all the time. They weren't available everywhere, and that kept them kind of healthy. That kept them, gave them self-control. That gave them discipline. But today, kosher is widespread. Okay, it's not as great here as it is in America, but it's still pretty good. I mean, it's gotten, in the 9 years that we've been here, it's grown exponentially. You can get almost anything that you want. Okay, so maybe there are some chocolates that aren't kosher, but there's plenty that are kosher. And that's the reality that we live in. So it is very possible. It is very possible to eat kosher food your entire life and still have no self-control.
Yeah, I could do with some self-control when I go reaching for food that I don't need.
Right. And I think, again, a lot of us are in this situation, being at home a lot, not going out, and, there's a bit of stress eating too, and there's, that's very normal and natural. Yeah, that's so, like, there is a question we could ask on the Akedat Yitzchak as well, that it's not necessarily built into it. It could be, but it isn't. I think it is a powerful thing. I mean, unfortunately, the reality we're in right now, I mean, restaurants are struggling mightily. They're really, really suffering. But like being in Melbourne, and I from what I understand, Melbourne's this great foodie city, and people, love to go and to eat out and, make a big deal of it. And there's a lot of great non-kosher food. And so when you have to kind of make choices as to, like, well, I'm actually not going to do that, that is a powerful statement, right? That is a powerful statement. And so it could, in theory, but like I said, you could also go to religious communities who have everything that they want. I mean, you go to New York, forget Israel, right? You go to New York, there are not just fully kosher supermarkets, right? Okay, that you can imagine, because there's many Jews, right? So many Jews that they could have, full-on Kohl's that are just kosher. Everything's kosher. But there are full-on luxury supermarkets that are kosher. Pomegranate, right, is an upscale supermarket. All upscale, organic, whatever products. Every single thing there is kosher, right? So, like I said, you could have any, it doesn't necessarily, living a kosher life doesn't necessarily build within a person that discipline, that,
Rabbi.
Yes.
But beyond the kashrut itself, we've got so you've got your 3 hours you've got to take.
Yeah.
And you've got Birkat Hamazon, and you've got the blessing before. So even, so I think the Akedat Yitzchak has a point here, that is also beyond, specific, whether you can eat pork or can't. There is still some sort of self-control. You do the Netilat Yadayim, there is a self-control within, within the way Judaism or religious Judaism approaches eating. Yeah,
I think that's a great point. I don't want to minimize. I actually think Akedat Yitzchak is a really important point. Your point, when we combine it together with the Akedat Yitzchak, brings us, I think, to really the crux of the matter. I should have brought this mitzvah, this pasuk, and this idea here, but there's a pasuk of what's the pasuk? Right. Well, it's just, kadoshim tihiyu, you shall be holy. I forget the whole pasuk. Kadosh, Parshat Kedoshim, after Acharemot, Kedoshim tihiyu, shall be holy. What's this commandment to be holy? So the Rashi there says that holiness there is in reference to kind of being separate from certain physical, desires, namely inappropriate sexual desires. But the Ramban famously says that Kedoshim Tihiyu, you shall be holy, refers to an overarching, what we call a meta concept in the Torah. That it is possible for a person to drink lots of kosher wine, right? To drink only kosher wine, but still be a drunk, right? And it is possible for a person to eat only kosher food, but still be a glutton. So a person could be keeping the letter of the law and only doing all the kosher things, but yet still be in great violation of the Torah. So therefore, the Torah comes along, the Ramban says, and commands us, Kedoshim Tihiyu, you shall be holy. There's like this overarching thing. There's an overarching aspiration that each of us has to try to not be so kind of dragged down by our physical desires, to elevate them, to elevate our physical desires. And one of the ways that we do that is by choosing the foods that we eat and eating them a certain way. So yes, a person could eat only kosher food and completely be in violation of the Torah. So, your point, Dov, is a good one, right? Now, Akedat Yitzchak's point is a good one, that in theory, the mitzvot could be performed in a way that allows us to be healthier and to be have more self-control and to be more ethical. Right? We haven't spoken about ethical things relating to food yet. So I think in theory one could, or one could not. Right? It's just up to us to make that choice. On this point, and then I'll open it up for some more questions after that. Nechama Leibovitz, the great Torah scholar, the great Tanakh scholar, really one of a kind, and this is where I found the Akedat Yitzchak that we just read from. So she was undertaking this concept of the Akedat Yitzchak and bringing it back to kind of the opening to the Torah. She says the following thing: "And wherefore did the Holy One, blessed be He, bid him to eat from all of the trees of the garden and withhold one of them?" If you think about it, the first encounter that God has with Adam is, hey, Adam, you can eat everything, right? So the Torah says, eat everything, eat from all the trees. Can't eat animals yet, that only comes after Noah. Eat from all of the trees, except for one. Why? What's the point? What's the point of just that one? In order that his gaze should be continually directed towards it, and that he should thereby call to mind his creator and be conscious of the yoke of his maker upon him, and that his passion should not overwhelm him. What's she saying there? What do you think?
There's always got to be some restraint.
Yeah. What's interesting is, sorry, someone's going to say something?
Just remember, Adam, who's in charge here.
Yeah, right. It's like, Adam, I'm giving you all this, but there's rules. And are those rules necessarily rational or logical? Not necessarily. Like, was there anything worse about the Eitz HaChaim? The Eitz Hadat, the tree of knowledge of good and evil? Well, maybe. It's seemingly like if they would eat from it, they would kind of muddy up their mind, but maybe not. Maybe not. It wasn't necessarily what they ate. And this is a point that I've explored with many of you in the past. It wasn't necessarily what they ate that made it into the Eitz Hadat. It was how they ate it that transformed it from the Eitz HaChaim into the Eitz Hadat, from the tree of life that connects us to God into the tree of knowledge of good and evil. It was this violation of the will of God. And so one can look to all the laws of kashrut. Sometimes there is a very clear rational reason why we shouldn't eat this thing. Sometimes there isn't. Sometimes, well, actually, maybe that particular food is pretty healthy, but that doesn't matter. There are laws, and through those laws, God, we remember who's boss. We get self-discipline. We do get that. In theory, we could get that if our mind is on the bigger picture. Thoughts, questions? How are we going here so far?
Okay.
Throwing something
I'm sorry?
Can I throw in something just with all these new discoveries, the plant-based foods
Yeah.
that look like meat, but is not meat, or milk that's not milk, or par of milk rather. Down the track, do you think that that could be a problem? As in, people getting, when you're used to eating, when you're used to not seeing meat and milk on the table together,
Yeah.
things appear to be meat, but it's not. This looks like milk, but it's not, or milky. But
I mean, yeah, that's a good question. I mean, those issues existed already, thousands of years ago. They had certain almond milks and cheeses and stuff like that they made a long time ago, and halacha said that like if you're going to serve them together, you just need to make sure that there's almonds on the table so people can kind of recognize. So meaning what they did was they put something in place to say everyone know that this is what it is, so there isn't marit ayin. I think now we live in a time where we understand, okay, actually you can make pretty good fake meat, right? You can make pretty good par of milk, right, out of whatever you can make it out of. So we're aware of that, and there isn't an issue, right? You could say, well, maybe there's an issue with kind of combining those tastes together. God does not want us to combine those tastes together. That's not it at all, right? Let me just show you a really interesting Gemara, which is interesting for many different reasons. I don't want to go into all of it. It'll take us way too. Okay, so there's a famous Gemara with Yalta. Yalta is, I think, one of 3 women whose name is mentioned in the entire Shas. So in the entire Gemara, there's only, I think, 3 women whose name is mentioned in a positive light. That's for another time. There are some really fascinating shiurim on that. Yalta is one of them. Her husband was Rav Nachman, and she discusses, I'm not going to go into great detail of all of these things. You can look at this later, but basically she says that as a rule, if God prohibited anything to us, he gave us a similar item that was permitted, right? Because we might think that there is something really, really negative about the experience of consuming a particular thing. But God permits an alternative to that, right? So you might think, let's stay away from that stuff altogether. Like, don't even touch it. No, that's not so clear, right? You can't have that, but you can have that. So he says, he prohibited to us the consumption of blood, yet he permitted to us the consumption of liver, which is filled with blood. Okay, this next point I'm not going to go into in great detail, but God prohibited sexual intercourse with a woman who is menstruating, yet it is permitted to have sexual intercourse with a woman during what's called the Demei Tahara. So again, I'm not going to go into great detail of that, but after a woman gives birth, there's a particular time in which the blood, now we don't really discern between these, back then they did, where the blood that comes out is considered pure blood as opposed to blood that makes one impure. So again, we see that there's certain experiences that could be, in one circumstance is kind of against the Torah, and another circumstance is permitted. God prohibits the fat of a domesticated animal, but permitted the fat of an undomesticated animal, et cetera, et cetera. So what we see there is that you could think we got to stay away from this stuff altogether because it's so bad for us. So like there's something about taking milk and meat, that mixture that's really bad for us. So then we stay away from anything that resembles it completely. That's not the case. It's specifically milk and meat that is prohibited. And it is specifically these things that are prohibited because why? And I hate this answer, but I actually think it's deeper than it's the deepest thing. Why? And this is my son's saying, why do we have to do that? What's the answer?
Because I said so.
Because he said so, or well, he said so, right? Because God said so, right? Because God said so, which is again a very unsatisfying answer, especially to a young teenager. Like, God said so. Who is this God, right? But there's something really deep and powerful about that when you start to understand. Well, yes, rationally we can rationalize almost anything, any sort of behavior. Human beings have learned how to rationalize. But when we give ourselves over to a higher power who says this but not that, there's something powerful. There's something beautiful behind that. That doesn't mean that there are not rational reasons why we don't have milk and meat, for example. I mean, there's something really powerful about the idea of not mixing milk and meat. Many different things have been said about that. Like, for example, the milk, which represents the life that a mother gives to their child and sustains and nourishes their own, being. We're going to use that thing to cook and to prepare something that is the death of it. So yes, the Torah says, Lo tivashel gadi b'chalei v'mo. It says that in this week's Parsha as well. One of the 3 times in the Torah that's mentioned. Do not cook a kid in its mother's milk. That's where the prohibition comes from. And you could say, oh, well, the prohibition only relates specifically to a kid, a goat, in its mother's milk. We could say that, but the rabbis say no. The rabbis say we extend that concept to, now that we have separate kitchens, right? That's where it basically comes down to, right? You all know the famous joke with Moshe where, God says, do not cook a kid in its mother's milk. So Moshe's like, so does that mean we have to wait 6 hours in between milk and meat? And God's like, no, don't cook a kid in its mother's milk. So Moshe's like, does that mean that we need to have separate, separate dishes between, and God's like, no, don't cook a kid in its mother's milk. So Moshe's like, does that mean that you need to get a separate oven and a whole separate kitchen? And God's like, you know what, just do whatever you want. I don't care, right? So the rabbis take this concept, and behind it is, there's a powerful rational message of taking life and preparing death. Okay, yes, we nourish ourselves through it, but it's taking, there's something cruel about that. But yet, that's not really the reason why. The real reason why is because God said so.
And Rev Noam, ultimately, that has to be the
Judith,
answer.
you're not allowed. You have to be passive.
I know I'm not allowed to speak, and I can't help myself though. I try not to, and then I just have to. I think ultimately that has to be the answer, because the whole thing about using rational, trying to find a rational reason means you can always argue for or against it. But ultimately, why do we do things? We do things because God said so. And it was funny because when Elizabeth made the point about the chocolate, I was thinking the same, but then it's also the Shabbat thing, which isn't food related, but it's incredible how all through Shabbat, my kids will never say, can we turn on the TV? Can we put electronics on? But, the second Shabbat's over, it's time for electronics. And, as a parent, you say, oh no, we're not going to do it tonight. We're not going to do it tonight. But Shabbat is the only time that, nobody asks the question. And so as the ultimate parent, and it is that idea of having those rules and saying, no, we just don't do it. And the same thing with kashrut, no one in my house turns around and says, I want some, even after watching MasterChef, and they don't want their, pork crackling, but, they don't ask for it. But, everything that is permitted, we do. And so the self-control thing is really interesting, because we are masters at self-control over the things that we do. But once you go outside that, many of us don't have any self-control.
Well, that's a great question and a great point that you raised. I think about the idea of, I have the same story. I hate this idea of coming the second out of Shabbos and the kids are like, all right, we got to turn on the screens, right? It's like the second, like, come on, like, let's wait, but so we try to delay it a little bit, but it makes sense, right? But it's an ongoing battle, because it's like, well, didn't we just learn anything, right? Like that, how beautiful it is to sit around and, okay, we're all human beings, but in theory, I'm saying this is the theory, and it's not so easy to communicate into practice for all of us. We all have our issues that we wrestle with. But in theory, the lessons that we internalize through Shabbat and through Kashrut, we then can apply in other areas of our life. And I think that's the bigger goal. That doesn't mean that, the second Shabbos is over, people aren't going to want to go and rush and go put, again, the kids want to watch, movies, and we go to the phones to see, how much the world has fallen apart over the past 25 hours. So, we have different things that we're addicted to in a sense. It's a great point that you raise, but I think in theory, we should be able to then translate those things. And I think in the bigger picture, we do.
Yeah, and I guess we know we can do it, and that's what I found most interesting about when the Shabbat project was in its heyday, that people would say, I can't possibly do it. There's no way that I can get my kids off electronics for 25 hours. And, we say, well, that's a no-brainer, but it is interesting because you're right, we can do it. And in theory, it means we can apply it to other areas if we choose to.
Yeah. Let's take a look here. We've got just a couple of minutes left. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says this in the Sifra very clearly. A person shouldn't be disinterested in forbidden foods. Rather, a person should desire forbidden foods, but abstain solely because of divine decree. So you can watch MasterChef and see the crackling pork or pork crackling or whatever it is, and say, oh, that looks really good. But I'm not going to eat it because God said so. And there's a bigger power, as opposed to I'm not going to eat it because, oh, it's not good for me. Well, you can find ways, again, that once you're in that rational world, you can find ways to then move around that. But we don't do it. It's not disgusting. Oh, it's disgusting. No, it's probably not disgusting, right? We don't do it, not because it's disgusting or bad for us. There are some things that are bad for us that we shouldn't do, but there are other things that they're not necessarily bad for us, but we don't do them because the Torah says we don't do them. Rabbi Moshe Terrigan writes about this. He's really fantastic. And he relates to some of the points that have been raised already. And he first off speaks about the so he raises the Abarbanel and the Rambam and the Ramban, and he raises as well the point that Paul made before, that there is something about kashrut that, as he says here, they fully enforce these essential cultural barriers. Laws banning wine, which was handled by a Gentile, kosher bread manufactured in non-Jewish settings, further delimited Jewish cultural experience. A separate Jewish diet is intended to demarcate a separate Jewish cultural identity. The kashrut cultural barrier continues to influence Jewish public experience, even in the world of modern kashrut. And this is a hard one for a lot of people, but it's an important one. It's not necessarily so PC, but it is an important one that kind of keeps us together to an extent. It does keep us together. So he says, I'll just read his words just to take us home. Though the specific details of kashrut seem arbitrary, they possess profound logic, as God banned us from consuming hazardous items while allowing beneficial foods. Modern science hasn't yet traced human health and well-being to kashrut laws, but we still trust that this system isn't random. In a broader sense, limiting us to kosher foods is a method of curbing against the potential imbalances of unlimited food consumption. Secondly, kashrut experience erects vital cultural barriers intended to safeguard our unique Jewish identity. As the patterns of kosher food change, it's important to revisit these seminal principles. So let's just look back at what we have seen so far, just as a bit of review, and then we'll open up for any final questions if there are any. We first looked at the Rambam. The Rambam was very clear that non-kosher food is unhealthy, and therefore kosher food is healthy. And the reason, and God commanded to us, because again, the Rambam was a doctor. The Rambam cared about medicine, about human health. And again, by this, we see that Rambam, and the Rambam is consistent with other views in the Rambam says that taking care of one's body is an important mitzvah. That was a couple, 2 parshas ago. You shall guard your souls very well. The Ramban said a similar thing, that there's something immoral about eating particular animals. Non-kosher food is unhealthy. Therefore, kosher food is what it is because it's healthy for us. The Abarbanel disagrees. He says you can look in the world and see that many non-Jewish people eat non-kosher food and they're quite healthy, whereas you have many Jews who eat kosher food and aren't exactly so healthy. So he says that rather kashrut is there to give us spiritual health. Spiritual health. It allows us to experience, to purify our souls, and we don't necessarily see or sense the impact that having non-kosher food has on our souls. But as he says, believe you me, it is there. The Akedat Yitzchak said that kosher is not necessarily about spiritual health or physical health, but rather it allows a person to express self-control and to find self-control and discipline within their lives. The Chama Leibovitz relates this idea as well to the opening story in the Torah of Adam and Chava specifically being told not to eat something, because that's so central to who we are as human beings. But then that fact that we can't eat anything or everything allows us to be in a relationship with God. We spoke about as well about this thing that the mitzvot that we skipped over a little bit, some interesting things here, but the mitzvot, really, it's not about not wanting not kosher food. It's not about, not desiring something that's forbidden, but rather we can have a desire for them, but it's our deep connection to Hashem and a deep faith in Hashem that is really what it's all about, right? The Rav Shamshin Rafal Hirsch, he says very clearly, he says, you should observe the commandments of the Torah and have regard for its laws because they are at God's behest, not because you think them correct. Even those commandments whose reason you believe you have understood, you should not fulfill because of your understanding. For then you would be listening only to yourself, whereas you should listen to God. That's the words of Rav Shamshin Rafal Hirsch. So that sort of answer would have not been very satisfying to me even somewhat recently. Certainly as a teenager, like, I want to understand. I got to get it. I got to know why to do specific things. No, not necessarily. Not necessarily, because once we know it, we can unknow it. We can, once again, the rational human mind can convince ourselves of anything. We finished off, of course, with Rabbi Moshe Terrigan, who spoke about some of the cultural barriers that kashrut puts in, and also he reinforced this idea of the self-discipline that in theory, and this is something we discussed, the self-discipline in theory, kashrut, the world of kashrut, can invest within us. Any questions on that? That's been what we saw a lot. What are you thinking there?
Well, you mentioned cultural barriers, but at the same time, the cultural barriers that can be lowered through it. I'm thinking back to 1979. We made our first trip to the United States. I was a visiting scholar at Stanford University, and I contacted, because I was involved at the time with the Hillel Foundation, I contacted Hillel in Palo Alto, and the rabbi there, who was a progressive rabbi, put me in touch with the Orthodox community. And when we arrived in Palo Alto, straight away we were taken to lunch with a family, and given lunch because we had no food provided. And then through that, introduced to the local shul, the local minyan, and that was the basis for a friendship that has gone on for 20, 30, 40 years. A colleague of mine, non-Jewish, arrived also and had no such experience. He was ignored. He had to find his own way. It had made no particular friendships beyond his own connections at the university, but there was no sort of social life, whereas for us it was ready-made. And why did that come about? Well, because of this feeling that we belong to a group of people. So I don't see it just as a cultural barrier. I see it as a cultural gate.
Sure. Yeah, it definitely works both ways to create community, which of course the fact that now we can't break bread together, I think is so negative. It really has a deep impact on community. The fact that forget shul, which also is huge. But the fact that we can't have meals together, people can't have meals with their loved ones. I mean, this is and it's a big challenge. There's no question. Yeah. Any other questions, comments? People disagree with what I've shared this evening? Okay. So with that, I wish you all a wonderful evening and a wonderful Shabbos. I'll see you at Kabbalat Shabbat tomorrow afternoon at about 4:45. And have a great evening, everybody.
Thank you. You too, Rob.
Thank you.
See you guys.
Shabbos.
Take care.
See ya.